The year is 1933. The banks are shuttered. A farmer in Iowa watches the sheriff's auction sell his plow for pennies. A father in Detroit stares at a pay stub that says 0 hours worked. In New York, a financier steps out of a window on Wall Street. These images are seared into our collective memory: the Great Depression as a natural disaster, a perfect storm of greed and panic, a capitalist fever that broke on Black Tuesday. But the images are a lie. The greatest economic catastrophe in modern history was not an accident of nature, and it was not caused by the stock market crash. The Great Depression was a policy assassination, a deliberate act of economic self-destruction driven by a fundamental misunderstanding of how money works. And we are still paying for the mistakes of the men who caused it. What if the recovery we celebrate was actually the mechanism that ensured the suffering would last a decade? What if the real origin of the Depression isn't what you think it is at all? Most people, even educated ones, believe the Great Depression was a single, inevitable event caused by the 1929 stock market crash. The narrative is simple and seductive. The Roaring Twenties were a bubble of irrational exuberance, fortunes were made on paper, and when the music stopped, the whole house of cards collapsed. This is the narrative of high school history textbooks. They speak of overproduction and underconsumption, the idea that factories produced too much and workers were paid too little. We're told that the causes were structural rot, inequality, and a systemic failure of capitalism itself. It's a morality play. Greed led to ruin. This is the myth. It places the blame on the invisible hand of the market, or the boundless greed of speculators. It is comforting to think that the Depression was a random event, a product of its time. But this story is not just simplistic, it is disastrously wrong. It ignores the paper trail of policy decisions, the deliberate acts of central bankers that transformed a recession into a cataclysm, and a slow-motion policy disaster that turned a market correction into the systematic destruction of the global economy. To understand the Depression, you must first understand a machine that most historians ignore: the global gold standard. Not as a romantic relic of the past, but as a financial straitjacket, a system designed to ensure monetary discipline but which instead acted as a deflationary death grip. The theory was that the gold standard was an automatic stabilizer. If a country lost gold, its money supply contracted, prices fell, and exports became cheap, bringing the gold back. It was supposed to be a self-correcting mechanism. Instead, after World War I, it was a broken, brittle system controlled by a dysfunctional Federal Reserve. The Fed, acting as the world's primary guardian of gold, was supposed to be a lender of last resort. But between 1928 and 1929, it did the opposite. Benjamin Strong, the powerful governor of the New York Fed, obsessed with Wall Street speculation, engineered a massive monetary contraction. He raised interest rates to cool the fever of the stock market, a policy that was recognized at the time by economists like William Foster and Waddell Catchings as deflationary and a guaranteed path to depression. The Fed turned a valve that was supposed to control inflation, but instead, it strangled the entire economy. They squeezed the lifeblood, the money supply, out of the system. This wasn't a market failure. It was a central bank failure. Historians get this wrong. They obsess over the stock market crash as the cause, but the crash was a symptom, a terrifying consequence of the Fed's policy. In 1929, the Fed didn't just allow the money supply to contract, they actively tightened it. The economy had been running on a 4.6% annual growth rate in the money supply from 1921 to 1929. When the Fed slammed on the brakes to pop the stock bubble, the economic car didn't just slow down, the engine seized. The money supply fell by a staggering 30% between 1929 and 1933. A 30% contraction in the currency. That is the statistical signature of an execution, not a recession. The human consequence of this was immediate and brutal. As money became scarce, prices collapsed. Farmers, heavily indebted, saw the price of wheat drop from over $2 a bushel in 1929 to under 40 cents by 1932. Their real debt burden ballooned, the debt deflation trap. They produced food, they worked harder than ever, but they couldn't afford to eat, and they couldn't pay their banks. The banks, holding these bad loans, collapsed en masse. In 1930 alone, over 1,300 banks failed. This wasn't an act of God, it was an act of the Federal Reserve, which sat idly by and watched the money supply evaporate. The Fed could have stopped this. But they didn't. The prevailing real bills doctrine preached that the Fed should only accommodate productive, commercial loans, not speculative ones. They watched the economy burn because they couldn't see the flames from their ivory tower. The crash was the match, but the Fed had already soaked the house in gasoline. While the Fed was strangling the domestic economy, the U.S. government delivered the coup de grace to the global system. On June 17, 1930, President Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Historians often dismiss this as an act of protectionist folly. They call it a mistake. But it was more than a mistake, it was a weapon of mass economic destruction. The tariff was designed to protect American industries by raising taxes on over 20,000 imported goods. The intention, as they say, was to buy American. But the execution was genocidal to global trade. When Hoover signed the bill, he ignored a desperate plea from 1,000 economists who begged him not to. Why? Because they understood the mechanism of the gold standard better than he did. Under the gold standard, all currencies were in a fixed relationship. You couldn't just devalue your way out of a trade deficit. The tariff made imports more expensive, sure. But it also stopped foreign nations from earning the dollars they needed to buy American exports. In retaliation, over 60 countries raised their own tariffs, creating a fortress of trade barriers. The result? Global trade collapsed by over 60% between 1929 and 1932. This wasn't just about lost profits for U.S. steel and auto manufacturers, it was a policy that directly destroyed the world's ability to service its debts. Germany, crushed by war reparations, could no longer export to earn gold. This ignited a chain reaction of sovereign defaults. The tariff didn't just hurt foreigners, it pushed the global financial system into a state of total sclerosis. This is where the story takes a dark, perverse turn. You have been told that the New Deal was the salvation, the moment FDR rode in to save the nation. But for millions of Americans, the New Deal was a prison warden, not a savior. The Roosevelt administration, eager to fix the economy, created the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, in 1933. It was supposed to stabilize industry and allow workers to unionize. But the NIRA had a hidden clause. It allowed businesses in the same industry to collude on prices and wages, provided they accepted collective bargaining. This wasn't economic planning. It was a state-sponsored cartel. Fair competition codes were established for over 500 industries. The goal, on the surface, was to stop deflation by preventing cutthroat competition. But the mechanism had a horrific unintended consequence. This is the part they don't teach you in school. By allowing firms to coordinate on high wages, the NIRA effectively froze the labor market. The wage rates in manufacturing, heavily covered by the NIRA, skyrocketed above the trend line even as productivity collapsed. The insiders who had jobs raised their wages to a level that was completely unsustainable. But what about the outsiders, the millions of unemployed who would have gladly worked for lower pay? They were locked out. The NIRA's wage codes prevented the market from clearing. Economist Harold L. Cole and Lee E. Ahanian of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis proved that this policy created a significant distortion in the labor market. The high wages that NIRA mandated led directly to what historians call the weak recovery. It put an artificial floor under wages that was artificially high, and it strangled the recovery by making it illegal for the unemployed to compete for jobs. The truth is far darker. The New Deal, in this critical aspect, institutionalized unemployment. Historians often celebrate FDR's 1933 abandonment of the gold standard as the key to recovery. They are only half right. Leaving the gold standard was essential. It allowed the government to print money again. But by the time Roosevelt took office, the damage was already terminal. And his devaluation of the dollar wasn't a cure. It was a life support machine that breathed new life into a patient who had been poisoned by the regime change. Consider this. While the New Deal signaled a regime change, the iron grip of the gold standard had already done its work. The gold standard transmitted the monetary contraction globally, not just in the US. Countries that clung to the gold standard the longest, like France, suffered the longest depressions. But even after devaluation, the hangover from the previous regime remained. The devaluation of the dollar was a powerful signal of change, but it was a signal of desperation. Roosevelt's devaluation, carried out in April and July 1933, gave a huge jolt to farm prices, ending the deflationary psychology. But it wasn't enough. The very structure of the American economy had been distorted. The NERA was still in effect. That the National Recovery Administration continued to enforce its cartel codes. The government provided a shot of adrenaline to the heart of the economy, but the central nervous system, the labor market, was still paralyzed. This is the nuance the standard narrative misses. The U.S. was trapped between the deflationary policies of the Hoover era and the regulatory gridlock of the New Deal. Let's put names to the numbers. We are talking about 25% unemployment. But those figures are abstractions. Think of the 11-year-old boy in Chicago who had to drop out of school to pick coal off the railroad tracks to heat his family's home. Think of the women in the garment district who saw their weekly wages, if they had a job, plunge from $18 to $7. The New Deal's high-wage theory was a death sentence for the unskilled. As you now understand, this was a supply-side shock induced by policy. The NERA protected the unionized factory worker, but it priced the black sharecropper in the South and the immigrant laborer in the city out of the workforce. It wasn't just a capitalist crisis, it was a policy that protected the haves and punished the have-nots. President Roosevelt's own labor secretary, Francis Perkins, admitted years later that the NERA was a hodgepodge and a mistake. But that was a quiet confession, not a headline. Meanwhile, the suffering continued. The Dust Bowl, often seen as a separate natural disaster, was made worse by the economic collapse. Without money, farmers couldn't purchase the equipment to implement soil conservation techniques. They just plowed deeper, destroying the land and creating the dust storms. The economic ecosystem and the physical ecosystem collapsed simultaneously. Every decision, the Fed's tight money, Hoover's tariff, Roosevelt's NERA, stole dignity, stole hope, and stole lives. Here is the ultimate irony. The solution to the Depression, the New Deal's industrial cartels, was designed to save capitalism by preserving corporate profits. It was a nationalistic, corporatist compromise. But in its execution, it prevented the very recovery it was supposed to enable. The Roosevelt administration, in its desperate attempt to prevent cutthroat competition and deflation, created a deflationary spiral of another kind, a wage spiral that destroyed the job market. But what historians really get wrong is the class aspect. They frame the era as the rich versus the poor. But the NERA protected the interests of insiders against outsiders. The rich didn't win here. Corporate profits plunged during the Depression. The New Deal didn't save the elites, it created a bureaucratic safety net for incumbent workers that failed to resuscitate the economy. The financiers, the men who had caused the crash, lost their fortunes too. J.P. Morgan Jr. saw his wealth decimated. The stock market wouldn't regain its 1929 high for 25 years. So the narrative of the rich getting richer is a myth. The real story is that a political class in Washington, armed with a flawed theory of economics, held the entire nation hostage to their great experiment at the cost of a lost decade. The pattern is repeating. Today, the echoes of the Great Depression are deafening. We have the Federal Reserve again, obsessed with preventing a financial bubble, tightening monetary policy despite economic softness. We have protectionist tariffs being weaponized. We are seeing governments create supply chain, cartels, and industrial policy that look remarkably like the NERA, favoring specific sectors, picking winners and losers, setting wage floors, and increasing bureaucratic control. The lesson of 1929 to 33 is not that capitalism failed, it was that government intervention failed. That experts of the 1930s were certain they could manage the economy, they failed catastrophically. Just as in the 1930s, we are told we must accept a new normal of lower growth and higher unemployment to save the economy. The language of stimulus is used, but the actions often result in the opposite. The Fed's quantitative easing policies are not a solution, they are an admission of a system that is sick. The establishment of the New Deal-style institutions prevented the natural market clearing that could have allowed a rapid V-shaped recovery. They assumed the economy was a machine to be programmed, not a living system to be healed. The true origin of the Great Depression is a paradox. It was a crisis of doing too much, and too little, simultaneously. The Fed did too much to constrain the money supply, and too little to bail out the banks. The government did too much to regulate wages, and too little to let markets adapt. The lesson is a universal law of economics: the economy is a complex adaptive system. Interventions that feel intuitive, like raising rates to stop speculation, or setting minimum wages to ensure a fair share, often produce the opposite outcome. The Great Depression was not a failure of the market, it was a failure of the state to understand the limits of its power. The market's correction was painful, but the government's cure was fatal. Until we learn that economic policy must be humble, forensic, and aware of its own potential for destruction, we will always be at risk of creating the very catastrophe we seek to prevent. We've just uncovered a hidden history of the Great Depression, a story of how bureaucratic decisions, not free markets, caused the catastrophe, and how the cure ensured the suffering lasted a decade. Most historians will continue to tell you the fairy tale about the greedy stockbrokers and the overproduction of goods. But you are one of the few who now knows the real, dark mechanics of monetary policy and labor market distortion. If you found this forensic examination as compelling as I think you did, you'll want to join the inner circle. Subscribe to Markets of the Past to get access to the archives that expose the pattern of state failure. And for today's engagement loop, drop a in the comments if you made it this far. Show me you understand the price of this knowledge. And here's the question that will separate the historians from the history destroyers. Was the New Deal a cause of the Great Depression's length, or was it its savior? Let me know what you think, but remember, the truth is in the data, not the dogma.